Question 17, Part 2 of Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. Summa Theologica, Pars Prima Secundae, on the last end and on human acts, by St. Thomas Aquinas. Translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 17. Of the acts commanded by the will in 9 articles. Part 2. Fifth article. Part 1 of the second part. Question 17, Article 5. Whether the act of the will is commanded? Objection 1. It would seem that the act of the will is not commanded, for Augustine says, Confessions 8, 9, the mind commands the mind to will, and yet it does not. But to will is the act of the will, therefore the act of the will is not commanded. Objection 2. Further, to receive a command belongs to one who can understand the command, but the will cannot understand the command, for the will differs from the intellect, to which it belongs to understand. Therefore the act of the will is not commanded. Objection 3. Further, if one act of the will is commanded, for the same reason all are commanded. But if all the acts of the will are commanded, we must needs proceed to infinity, because the act of the will precedes the act of reason commanding, as stated above, Article 1. For if that act of the will be also commanded, this command will be preceded by another act of the reason, and so on to infinity. But to proceed to infinity is not possible. Therefore the act of the will is not commanded. On the contrary, whatever is in our power is subject to our command, but the acts of the will, most of all, are in our power, since all our acts are said to be in our power, in so far as they are voluntary. Therefore the acts of the will are commanded by us. I answer that, as stated above, Article 1, command is nothing else than the act of the reason directing, with a certain motion, something to act. Now it is evident that the reason can direct the act of the will, for just as it can judge it to be good to will something, so it can direct by commanding man to will. From this it is evident that an act of the will can be commanded. Reply Obj. 1. As Augustine says, Confessions 8, 9, when the mind commands itself perfectly to will, then already it wills. But that sometimes it commands and wills not, is due to the fact that it commands imperfectly. Now imperfect command arises from the fact that the reason is moved by opposite motives to command or not to command. Wherefore it fluctuates between the two and fails to command perfectly. Reply Obj. 2. Just as each of the members of the body works not for itself alone, but for the whole body. Thus it is for the whole body that the eye sees. So it is with the powers of the soul. For the intellect understands, not for itself alone, but for all the powers. And the will wills not only for itself, but for all the powers too. Wherefore man, in so far as he is endowed with intellect and will, commands the act of the will for himself. Reply Obj. 3. Since command is an act of reason, that act is commanded which is subject to reason. Now the first act of the will is not due to the direction of the reason, but to the instigation of nature, or of a higher cause, as stated above, Question 9, Article 4. Therefore there is no need to proceed to infinity. Sixth article, Part 1 of the second part. Question 17, Article 6. Whether the act of the reason is commanded? Objection 1. It would seem that the act of the reason cannot be commanded, for it seems impossible for a thing to command itself. But it is the reason that commands, as stated above, Article 1. Therefore the act of the reason is not commanded. Objection 2. Further, that which is essential is different from that which is by participation. But the power whose act is commanded by reason is rational by participation, as stated in Ethic. I, 13. Therefore the act of that power which is essentially rational is not commanded. Obj. 3: Further, that act is commanded which is in our power. But to know and judge the truth, which is the act of reason, is not always in our power. Therefore the act of the reason cannot be commanded. On the contrary, that which we do of our free will can be done by our command. But the acts of the reason are accomplished through the free will. For Damascene says (De Fide Orth. ii, 22) that "by his free will man inquires, considers, judges, approves." Therefore the acts of the reason can be commanded. I answer that, Since the reason reacts on itself, just as it directs the acts of other powers, so it can direct its own act. Consequently its act can be commanded. But we must take note that the act of the reason may be considered in two ways. First, as to the exercise of the act. And considered thus, the act of the reason can always be commanded; as when one is told to be attentive and to use one's reason. Secondly, as to the object; in respect of which two acts of the reason have to be noticed. One is the act whereby it apprehends the truth about something. This act is not in our power, because it happens in virtue of a natural or supernatural light. Consequently in this respect, the act of the reason is not in our power, and cannot be commanded. The other act of the reason is that whereby it assents to what it apprehends. If, therefore, that which the reason apprehends is such that it naturally assents thereto, for example, the first principles, it is not in our power to assent or dissent to the like. Assent follows naturally, and consequently, properly speaking, is not subject to our command. But some things which are apprehended do not convince the intellect to such an extent as not to leave it free to assent or dissent, or at least suspend its assent or dissent, on account of some cause or other; and in such things assent or dissent is in our power, and is subject to our command. Reply Obj. 1: Reason commands itself, just as the will moves itself, as stated above (Q. 9, A. 3). That is to say, in so far as each power reacts on its own acts, and from one thing tends to another. Reply Obj. 2: On account of the diversity of objects subject to the act of the reason, nothing prevents the reason from participating in itself. Thus the knowledge of principles is participated in the knowledge of the conclusions. The reply to the third object is evident from what has been said. _______________________ SEVENTH ARTICLE (Part 1 of the Second Part), Question 17, Article 7. Whether the act of the sensitive appetite is commanded? Objection 1: It would seem that the act of the sensitive appetite is not commanded. For the Apostle says (Rom. 7:15): "For I do not do that good which I will." And a gloss explains this by saying that man lusts, although he wills not to lust. But to lust is an act of the sensitive appetite. Therefore the act of the sensitive appetite is not subject to our command. Obj. 2: Further, corporeal matter obeys God alone, to the effect of formal transmutation, as was shown in the First Part (Q. 65, A. 4; Q. 91, A. 2; Q. 110, A. 2). But the act of the sensitive appetite is occupied by a formal transmutation of the body, consisting in heat or cold. Therefore the act of the sensitive appetite is not subject to man's command. Obj. 3: Further, the proper motive principle of the sensitive appetite is something apprehended by sense or imagination. But it is not always in our power to apprehend something by sense or imagination. Therefore the act of the sensitive appetite is not subject to our command. On the contrary, Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Nat. Hom. xvi) says: "That which obeys reason is twofold, the concupiscible and the irascible, which belong to the sensitive appetite." Therefore the act of the sensitive appetite is subject to the command of reason. I answer that, An act is subject to our command, in so far as it is in our power, as stated above (A. 5). Consequently, in order to understand in what manner the act of the sensitive appetite is subject to the command of reason, we must consider in what manner it is in our power. Now it must be observed that the sensitive appetite differs from the intellective appetite, which is called the will, in the fact that the sensitive appetite is a power of a corporeal organ, whereas the will is not. Again, every act of a power that uses a corporeal organ depends not only on a power of the soul, but also on the disposition of that corporeal organ. Thus the act of vision depends on the power of sight, and on the condition of the eye, which condition is a help or hindrance to that act. Consequently, the act of the sensitive appetite depends not only on the appetitive power, but also on the disposition of the body. Now whatever part of the power of the soul takes in the act, follows apprehension; and the apprehension of the imagination, being a particular apprehension, is regulated by the apprehension of reason, which is universal; just as a particular active power is regulated by a universal active power. Consequently, in this respect, the act of the sensitive appetite is subject to the command of reason. On the other hand, condition or disposition of the body is not subject to the command of reason; and consequently, in this respect, the movement of the sensitive appetite is hindered from being wholly subject to the command of reason. Moreover, it happens sometimes that the movement of the sensitive appetite is aroused suddenly in consequence of an apprehension of the imagination of sense; and then such movement occurs without the command of reason, although reason could have prevented it had it foreseen. Hence the Philosopher says (Polit. i, 2) that the reason governs the irascible and concupiscible, not by a despotic supremacy, which is that of a master over his slave, but by a politic and royal supremacy, whereby the free are governed, who are not wholly subject to command. Reply Obj. 1: That man lusts, although he wills not to lust, is due to a disposition of the body, whereby the sensitive appetite is hindered from perfect compliance with the command of reason. Hence the Apostle adds (Rom. 7:15): "I see another law in my members, fighting against the law of my mind." This may also happen through a sudden movement of concupiscence, as stated above. Reply Obj. 2: The condition of the body stands in a twofold relation to the act of the sensitive appetite. First, as preceding it; thus a man may be disposed in one way or another, in respect of his body, to this or that passion. Secondly, as consequent to it; thus a man becomes heated through anger. Now the condition that precedes is not subject to the command of reason, since it is due either to nature or to some previous movement, which cannot cease at once. But the condition that is consequent follows the command of reason, since it results from the local movement of the heart, which has various movements according to the various acts of the sensitive appetite. Reply Obj. 3: Since the external sensible is necessary for the apprehension of the senses, it is not in our power to apprehend anything by the senses, unless the sensible be present; which presence of the sensible is not always in our power, for it is then that man can use his senses if he will so to do, unless there be some obstacle on the part of the organ. On the other hand, the apprehension of the imagination is subject to the ordering of reason, in proportion to the strength or weakness of the imaginative power. For that man is unable to imagine the things that reason considers, is either because they cannot be imagined, such as incorporeal things, or because of the weakness of the imaginative power, due to some organic indisposition. _Eighth Article. Part 1 of the Second Part. Question 17, Article 8. Whether the act of the vegetal soul is commanded? Objection 1. It would seem that the acts of the vegetal soul are subject to the command of reason. For the sensitive powers are of a higher rank than the vegetal powers. But the powers of the sensitive soul are subject to the command of reason. Much more, therefore, are the powers of the vegetal soul. Objection 2. Further, man is called a little world. Aristotle, Phys. viii, 2. because the soul is in the body, as God is in the world. But God is in the world in such a way that everything in the world obeys His command. Therefore all that is in man, even the powers of the vegetal soul, obey the command of reason. Obj. 3: Further, praise and blame are awarded only to such acts as are subject to the command of reason. But in the acts of the nutritive and genitive power there is room for praise and blame, virtue and vice, as in the case of gluttony and lust, and their contrary virtues. Therefore the acts of these powers are subject to the command of reason. On the contrary, Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Nat. Hom. xxii) says that "the nutritive and genitive power is one over which the reason has no control." I answer that, Some acts proceed from the natural appetite, others from the animal, or from the intellectual appetite, for every agent desires an end in some way. Now the natural appetite does not follow from some apprehension, as do the animal and the intellectual appetite. But the reason commands by way of apprehensive power: wherefore those acts that proceed from the intellective or animal appetite can be commanded by reason, but not those acts that proceed from the natural appetite; and such are the acts of the vegetal soul. Wherefore Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Nat. Hom. xxii) says that generation and nutrition belong to what are called natural powers. Consequently the acts of the vegetal soul are not subject to the command of reason. Reply Obj. 1: The more immaterial an act is, the more noble it is, and the more it is subject to the command of reason. Hence the very fact that the acts of the vegetal soul do not obey reason shows that they are ranked lowest. Reply Obj. 2: The comparison holds in a certain respect, because, to wit, as God moves the world, so the soul moves the body. But it does not hold in every respect, for the soul did not create the body out of nothing, as God created the world, for which reason the world is wholly subject to His command. Reply Obj. 3: Virtue and vice, praise and blame do not affect the acts themselves of the nutritive and genitive power, for example, digestion and formation of the human body; but they affect the acts of the sensitive part, that are ordained to the acts of generation and nutrition; for example, the desire for pleasure in the act of taking food or in the act of generation, and the right or wrong use thereof. _______________________ NINTH ARTICLE (part. 2, Q. 17, Art. 9) Whether the acts of the external members are commanded? Objection 1: It would seem that the members of the body do not obey reason as to their acts. For it is evident that the members of the body are more distant from the reason than the powers of the vegetal soul. But the powers of the vegetal soul do not obey reason, as stated above (A. 8). Therefore much less do the members of the body obey. Obj. 2: Further, the heart is the principle of animal movement. But the movement of the heart is not subject to the command of reason. For Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Nat. Hom. xxii) says that "the pulse is not controlled by reason." Therefore the movement of the bodily members is not subject to the command of reason. Obj. 3: Further, Augustine says (De Civ. Dei xiv, 16) that "the movement of the genital members is sometimes inopportune and not desired; sometimes when sought it fails; and whereas the heart is warm with desire, the body remains cold." Therefore the movements of the members are not obedient to reason. On the contrary, Augustine says (Confess. viii, 9): "The mind commands the movement of the hand, and so ready is the hand to obey, that scarcely can one discern obedience from command." I answer that, The members of the body are organs of the soul's powers. Consequently, according as the powers of the soul stand in respect of obedience to reason, so do the members of the body stand in respect thereof. Since then the sensitive powers are subject to the command of reason, whereas the natural powers are not. Therefore all movements of members that are moved by the sensitive powers are subject to the command of reason, whereas those movements of members that arise from the natural powers are not subject to the command of reason. Reply Obj. 1: The members do not move themselves, but are moved through the powers of the soul, of which powers some are in closer contact with the reason than are the powers of the vegetal soul. Reply Obj. 2: In things pertaining to intellect and will, that which is according to nature stands first, whence all other things are derived. Thus from the knowledge of principles that are naturally known is derived knowledge of the conclusions; and from volition of the end naturally desired is derived the choice of the means. So also in bodily movements the principle is according to nature. Now the principle of bodily movements begins with the movement of the heart. Consequently the movement of the heart is according to nature, and not according to the will. For like a proper accident it results from life, which follows from the union of soul and body. Thus the movement of heavy and light things results from their substantial form, for which reason they are said to be moved by their generator, as the Philosopher states (Phys. viii, 4). Wherefore this movement is called vital. For which reason Gregory of Nyssa (Nemesius, De Nat. Hom. xxii) says that "just as the movement of generation and nutrition does not obey reason, so neither does the pulse, which is a vital movement." By the pulse he means the movement of the heart, which is indicated by the pulse veins. Reply Obj. 3: As Augustine says (De Civ. Dei xiv, 17, 20), it is in punishment of sin that the movement of these members does not obey reason; in this sense, that the soul is punished for its rebellion against God, by the insubmission of that member, whereby original sin is transmitted to posterity. But because, as we shall state later on, the effect of the sin of our first parent was that his nature was left to itself, through the withdrawal of the supernatural gift which God had bestowed on man, we must consider the natural cause of this particular member's insubmission to reason. This is stated by Aristotle (De Causis of Movement of Animals), who says that "the movements of the heart and of the organs of generation are involuntary"; and that the reason of this is as follows. These members are stirred at the occasion of some apprehension, in so far as the intellect and imagination represent such things as arouse the passions of the soul, of which passions these movements are a consequence. But they are not moved at the command of the reason or intellect, because these movements are conditioned by a certain natural change of heat and cold, which change is not subject to the command of reason. This is the case with these two organs in particular, because each is as it were a separate animal being, in so far as it is a principle of life, and the principle is virtually the whole. For the heart is the principle of the senses, and from the organ of generation proceeds the seminal virtue, which is virtually the entire animal. Consequently they have their proper movements naturally, because principles must needs be natural, as stated above. Reply Obj. 2. End of question 17, part 2.